It's funny how sometimes a character with a relatively minor role becomes iconic, to the point of receiving countless stories and spin-offs about them and them alone. For the OT era, it was Boba Fett. For the prequel era, it's Darth Maul. Sometimes I frequent reaction channels, and a few weeks ago I stumbled upon Sorta Stupid and their reaction to the original trilogy. Or at least the reaction of one of them who had never seen the original trilogy before. The other two had, but years ago. There was a comment on the Return of the Jedi video in particular that kind of sums up both of these characters and how they attained their iconic status. Quote, "Love Ruff's reaction that Boba Fett's popularity is all vibes. Lol. Dude just looked cool. That's it. Lol." And yeah, that really is it. Character design and vibe. In some ways, Darth Maul's popularity is even more remarkable, as he only shows up in one of the prequel films to Boba Fett's appearance in 2 of the OT films. And on that note, it's time to cover a comic that I've actually known for a while and have been looking forward to talking about. Simply titled Star Wars Darth Maul, released between September and December of 2000, written by Ron Marz and principal art done by Jan Duursema. I hope I got that name right. I really couldn't find much about Marz. According to Wikipedia, apart from the Darth Maul comic we're talking about today, he contributed some to the Empire series and not much else. Artist Jan Duursema is a whole other matter entirely. It's fitting in a way because one of the first Star Wars videos I ever made was about a comic with the art done by Duursema, Dawn of the Jedi. Overall, Duursema has had a very prolific career, working for Marvel, DC, and Dark Horse, as well as writing an Elric comic, The Vanishing Tower, for First Comics in the late 80s. Her first foray into Star Wars was contributing to the original 1977 Marvel comic run, where she did interiors for issue 92. However, her career in terms of Star Wars really took off in 2000 when she was first partnered with writer John Ostrander. The two would partner on various projects, notably the Republic series and Star Wars Legacy. Evidently, the two had a very good working relationship, as Duursema not only did the art, but is even given story credits in various parts of Republic and Legacy, and is credited as the creator of Aayla Secura and Quinlan Vos. Finally, there is the cover art by Drew Struzan, a name who should not only be familiar to comic fans, but also to movie and book fans in terms of Star Wars, as he pretty much designed cover art and film posters for pretty much everything during the late 90s and early 2000s. He is responsible for the film posters for both the prequel films and the special edition of the original trilogy, which are some pretty iconic film posters, it must be said. But he has also the credit for countless book covers to his name, including several that I've done videos on for this channel. The Black Fleet Crisis trilogy, The Courtship of Princess Leia, A.C. Crispin's Han Solo trilogy, The Hand of Thrawn, the Jedi Prince series, Shadows of the Empire, Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina, and The Truce at Bakura. That's about it for production. Let's now talk about everyone's favorite evil Zabrak. Right from the get-go, this comic impresses, both in terms of writing and in terms of visuals. In fact, in my admittedly limited experience with Star Wars comics, I think I'm reasonably confident in saying that Darth Maul 2000 has the best intro thus far. How can I be so confident? Well, this is a 4-issue comic. Issue 1 is solely about the setup for the story, and yet Marz's writing and Duursema's art combine so perfectly that I never once felt impatient for the story proper to begin reading it, nor did I feel in the least bit disappointed when issue 1 ended and the story proper has yet to begin. Admittedly, I might have felt differently if this were 2000 and I had to wait 1 month between each issue. As one might expect of a Darth Maul story, we begin with the Sith apprentice having a training bout and reducing a bunch of combat droids to scrap. And Duursema's art starts flexing from the very first panel. At this point, I've seen quite a few different artists of varying quality in my reviews of Star Wars comic books. Christian Gossett is definitely more stylized and certainly more creative in his designs, while Brian Ching brings a solid painterly touch to his work. But Dursima's style is so slick and so clean and so very, very good at conveying action. The first 3 pages are just Darth Maul going from meditation to getting his lightsaber, and yet every frame looks so goddamn cool. And when he actually starts carving up the droids, forget 11, the cool factor gets turned up to 20. Words are inadequate to describe just how well the art and the paneling convey the action, and just flipping through these quickly for this video is insufficient either, so I really do recommend you read this for yourself. That is just the only way to get just how good this action scene is. 6 pages of awesome later, the fight is over, and Darth Sidious arrives to give Maul his marching orders. It is figuratively the eve of the Trade Federation blockade of Naboo, the first step in Sidious's plan to destroy the Jedi and take over the Republic. Of course, with a plan as complicated and long-term as his, anything can go wrong. Anyone could interfere with this. And so, the Sith Lord has called upon his favorite troubleshooter to deal with the criminal organization known as Black Sun. Now, given that Black Sun is essentially the most powerful and wide-reaching criminal organization in all the Star Wars galaxy, or at least the known Star Wars galaxy, and Maul is just one guy, and assuming you didn't know anything about his character, you would think that the Sith apprentice would be intimidated by this. But of course, after a slight bit of gearing up that reminds me very much of Arnold's gear-up montage from Commando, Maul only asks if his master wants Black Sun to be destroyed utterly. It turns out, no. Sidious thinks Black Sun might be useful to him someday, and besides, if Maul did that, then we wouldn't have Shadows of the Empire now, would we? Maul's task is to merely decapitate Black Sun's leadership, its overall commander, and his 9 lieutenants known as the Vigos. Without their boss and any obvious candidates to succeed him, Black Sun will turn upon itself and thus be in no position to interfere with Sidious's plans should they ever stumble across them. But of course, Sidious wants to make sure that this mission will be successful, and thus his apprentice will be given all the tools that he needs, apart from the Force and his lightsaber, obviously. And so this is where Sidious gifts Maul with the Sith Infiltrator, complete with probe droids for spying and a speeder bike for local transportation. Since the rest of Issue 1 is essentially Sidious laying out his plan for Maul, I think it's worth pointing out that Ron Mars, the writer, does a really good job of conveying Palpatine in this dialogue. Or rather, mostly monologue. Maul gives very short responses to his master. The point is, Mars gets the way that this character is supposed to speak. As I read this, I could very easily hear Ian McDermott's voice saying these lines. At any rate, Issue 1 ends with Maul boarding the Infiltrator and setting off on his mission from Coruscant. His presence is faintly and briefly sensed by Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi, and we're off to the races. From here on out, the remaining 3 issues are just that, Maul carrying out his plan to destroy the Master of Black Sun and his lieutenants. No introspection, no contemplation, no taking it sweet time. Darth Maul 2000, like the red and black assassin that it's all about, is a lean, mean action machine. Issue 2 is literally just Maul getting close enough to one of the Vigos, a Dug named Darnata, in order to kill him. He kills a Sullustan who was trying to flee from Black Sun because he owed them money, and uses that to get close enough to the Vigo to basically wipe him out and his whole entourage, all except for this one guy called Asanaga, whom he deliberately lets live, simply saying, someone has to. But Maul is a thorough creature, and since the station Darnava was operating from was all Black Sun, he basically blows it up just as Asanaga departs, thus ensuring that the thug is indeed the only one that survives to report to the Master of Black Sun. And in a nice bit of mirroring, Asanaga flees the station in panic the same way the Sullustan was attempting to at the very beginning of the chapter. Nice touch. The other interesting detail about issue 2 is that it features a cameo of someone we've met before in this series, Hath Monchar, the Trade Federation flunky whose treachery precipitated the events of Darth Maul Shadowhunter, which was published a year after this in 2001. He's trying to convince Darnada that the Sith are back, but of course the Vigo doesn't buy it and sends him packing right before Maul walks in, meaning that this comic takes place only a few days before the events of the book. At any rate, when word that one of the Vigos has been murdered gets out, the leader of Black Sun and the Vigos arrange to meet together to discuss the problem. Maul manages to find out where that place is right before killing one of the other Vigos. And so, on the tiny planet of Raltir in the core worlds, the final act is set to begin. And there really isn't anything more to say about the plot proper except that it plays out exactly as you would expect a Darth Maul story to play out. The Sith apprentice busts in, he cleans house, first the lackeys, then the bodyguards, then the Vigos, and finally kills the master. He reports success to Palpatine, his master tells him he's got a new assignment, likely pursuing Hath Monchar, thus setting up the events of Shadowhunter, the end. Once again, it mostly comes down to Jan Duursema selling the action through her art, and by God does she sell it well. Every action beat in every panel flows smoothly into the next. Every pose makes Maul look deadly and cool. And so once again, I can only say that this is a comic that must be read to be truly appreciated. But while the plot is pretty bare bones, there are a few interesting details in these last few chapters. For example, the scene when one of the Vigos, an Iktochi, whose species are natural telepaths, tries to interrogate Maul by looking into his mind, but finds something in there so dark and terrible that he's pretty much paralyzed, and thus an easy mark for the Sith. There's also the presence of another character who briefly appears in Shadowhunter, Ulth the Fondorian, the guy with crucial information about Black Sun, whom Padawan Darsha Asant was supposed to retrieve, but ultimately failed in doing so. Speaking of Black Sun, its leader, Alexei Garen, is essentially the epitome of the cold, ruthless bastard, acting calmly and ruthlessly as the situation calls for it. For example, when he realizes that Maul has wiped out all the Black Sun forces at the Raltir fortress, including the Vigo's most elite bodyguards, the man simply abandons them to their fate, literally locking the elevator door behind him. Because of course he knows by this point that Maul can't be stopped, and thus he needs time. And what better way to buy time to escape from the oncoming Sith than by putting as many warm bodies between him and Darth Maul as possible. The only ones he brings with him in his attempted flight are Ulth, who is his secretary, and his personal bodyguard, the Dathomir Night Sister, Miguela. It is noteworthy, though, that when Miguela realizes that Maul has already killed the Vigos and is gaining on her and her master, she immediately stays behind in order to delay Maul, even though her master insists that she should come with him. As he coldly puts it, her job is to kill for him, not die for him. So it seems that in his own calculated way, he does value her more than any of his lieutenants, while Miguela's insistence on staying behind shows her great loyalty to him. Now, of course, this comic was made in 2000, so before Clone Wars came along and made some significant alterations, shall we say, to the Force Witches of Dathomir. Particularly, this is before the concept of the Night Brothers was invented. Maul's brief dialogue with Miguela suggests that he knows of her kind, but only by reputation, while the Force Witch herself is completely ignorant of Maul's nature as a Sith. Duursema's action is once again incredible, but of course Maul wins. Ulth, seeing her bisected carcass fall into the water below, decides that his best chance of survival is abandoning his master to his fate and fleeing, which is of course how he ends up eventually on Coruscant in Shadowhunter. Even as his death bears down on him, though, Alexei Garen remains cold and calm. By this point, the crime lord has put two and two together and realized that Maul is in fact the long-dead Sith, returning to take vengeance upon the Jedi. Uncharacteristically, Maul allows Garen to monologue about how he was actually considered for Jedi training, having some Force sensitivity, but was rejected for being too old. Then again, Maul is supremely confident in victory, so perhaps he thinks it doesn't matter whether the crime lord gets some last words in before the end or not. To his credit, Garen manages to land one good cut on Maul, with presumably a vibro knife, and the two end up falling into the water, where Maul essentially drowns him. A brief time lapse, and Maul is back at his master's side, ready to undertake his next mission. Should Darth Maul 2000 be canon? Absolutely. Although I am going to put an asterisk on that one, because after all, that might change depending on what I think of the Clone Wars series and how it handles Dathomir and the Night Sisters. I will say though, having read it again for this video, I'm definitely putting this up there with KOTOR the comic and To the Last Man as one of my personal favorite Star Wars comics, period. Once again, the great selling point is Jan Duursima's art. Because the plot is so bare bones, it's the action and how it's portrayed that really carries the comic. And it's why I will reiterate that the only way to truly appreciate it is to read it for yourself. Barring a few scenes in the Clone Wars, this comic represents Maul at his absolute best. He's ruthless, he's utterly badass, and it really makes you wonder how the story might have gone differently if he had remained Sidious's apprentice. If you can afford to drop a few dollars on this comic, then get it. If you can do so via sites like eBay and thus avoid giving any dollars to Disney, better still. Until next time. He used to be called Citizen 625726. He used to call himself Unbroken. When he left his dystopian city behind, he thought he had found paradise. What he found was uglier and darker than anything he could have imagined. This is his story. This is Inferior. Now available in ebook, paperback, and audio form. Links in the description.